Welcome to Ideagen TV. Today we are ecstatic to have the president of WorkingNation and former Assistant Secretary of Labor, Jane Oates. Jane, welcome.
Thank you so much, George. It's great to be with you.
Jane, there are many people that we have interviewed on Ideagen TV, but not many like you. Meaning, we stand in awe of you as a global leader, a luminary, a person who had such incredible ability to peer around corners. That's who we really like to interview on Ideagen TV. People who have the uncanny ability to see around those corners to help predict, in some ways, all of the elements coming at us, including especially in workforce. There is no one more versed in workforce than you. So we're ecstatic, as I started with, to have you on Ideagen TV today.
Thank you, George. I'm so proud to be your friend and your colleague, and really looking forward to my conversation with the fabulous Matt Sigelman.
And that's a perfect segue. We are going to hear from yourself and Matt Sigelman from BurningGlass, and can't wait to hear all of the incredible insights and perspectives from you and Matt in this incredible discussion. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, George. I am so excited to introduce all of you to Matt Sigelman, who is a colleague and friend and just someone who's out there doing amazing work as the CEO of BurningGlass. Matt?
Jane, it's always so much fun to be together, and I share George's awe of the great Jane Oates, who, all kidding aside, you've done so much to really transform how we all think about the questions of workforce, whether those are manifest in government, where you previously served, whether those are the questions of workforce that companies deal with every day in terms of how they develop the talent they're going to need for the future. So thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you were my first choice and my first one. So first of all, BurningGlass is so important to me. I read your reports, I torment you and talk to you all the time. But would you just take a few minutes? Because I think most people know the words BurningGlass, but I'm not sure they know exactly who you are and exactly what you do.
BurningGlass takes a big data approach to try and understand the job market. We like to think of our work as mapping the genome of the job market. That sounds highfalutin, and we always like to, when doing marketing things, you always like to use highfalutin terms, but it's actually a really important metaphor, because here's the thing: when we think about the landscape of opportunity, when we think about the landscape of jobs, when we think about the landscape of talent, if you're a company, we tend to think of it in broad categories of jobs. Well, that seems logical enough. You're tracking the job market, you track jobs. But what we've learned from our approach, which involves collecting millions of jobs every day, studying hundreds of millions of people's career histories every year, what we've learned is that actually the job market's not driven by jobs. The job market is driven by skills. The job's just a collection of skills. And so what we do is we actually try to, for each of those millions of jobs we're collecting every day, we break them down. We've created our own language so that we can understand what are the skills that are in demand? What are the skills that unlock mobility between jobs? What are the skills that are transforming jobs? And that's, it's increasingly critical for people to understand, whether you're a worker, whether you're a company trying to manage your workforce and trying to understand what are the transformations that you need to contend with, how do you mobilize your workforce more effectively, whether you're a government agency trying to manage the skills of a region. And so that's where we feel very lucky to have that as our work. It's really allowing us to transform the way that companies think about their talent, the way that education institutions help people reach their potential and reach to opportunity, and the way that governments are thinking about their regions.
Matt, things that obviously, for our viewers, you are in Philadelphia, and if you can't tell from my accent, I grew up in Philadelphia and lived there for a long time. But when you come from a place like Philadelphia, equity, the Black Lives Matter movement is new for some people. For us, it's in our DNA, right? When you come from a city as diverse and rich in diversity as Philadelphia, you have to see that people have not had equal opportunities. What about this? We've talked before about the skills that could provide some of that mobility and create a more equitable place. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's such an important point and such an important question here, right? For this moment where we are all so focused as we, finally at last on questions of equity I think we've focused a lot this summer on the injustices of our system. One of them is that if you have a group of people who lack access to good jobs, to economic mobility, that's also a knee on the neck. And I think there's a lot of earnest work that's going on today. Across companies, across governments, across educators, trying to unlock equity in communities. But I think where we wind up getting stuck is that we think that talent is a zero-sum game. There's a fixed number of people of color in a given field. There's a fixed number of women in a given field. And that all we can do is shout louder or try to make ourselves a more hospitable environment for diverse talent. That's unfortunately a false narrative. The reality is that skills, we were talking a minute ago about skills are a vehicle for mobility. There are in a lot of cases jobs, there are talent pools that are out there that are actually only a few skills away from being the kind of talent that's eligible to actually move up into jobs that you're really struggling to fill. And so the question is, how do we identify those skill adjacencies? How do we identify those talent pools that are really close, actually? Kind of like what your rear view mirror says, that objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. I think that's both the big tragedy and the big opportunity of the job market, is that there are those kinds of talent pools that go underexploited. How do you identify them, number one? Number two, how do you identify the skills that activate them? What's the skill gap that needs to be bridged for people to move from those talent pools into the kinds of jobs that add value to a region, that add value to a company? And then you can, then step three is, how do you develop the training programs that are specifically titrated to make those jumps? Let me give you an example. And these examples, sort of are across the spectrum of opportunity. Somebody working as a shipping clerk. Shipping clerks make on average about $25,000 a year. They're, I want to say, about 41% people of color. A shipping clerk who learns some inventory management skills, maybe Microsoft Excel, can step up to being an operations coordinator. Operations coordinators are about 30% people of color, making the mid-30s. An operations coordinator who steps up and acquires, I think, sort of some basic project management skills, some light accounting skills, can move up again into a more dedicated logistics job, making in the 40s, which are generally only about 20% people of color. And so you see, think of it as really an arbitrage. Like, you remember from Microeconomics 101, that kind of like buy low, sell high thing. The ability to be able to move people from pools of talent that are more diverse into pools of talent that are less diverse, that from pools of talent that are stuck in the poverty trap to kind of opportunities that offer good mobility, that are good jobs. That's an arbitrage. It's a fundamental arbitrage that companies can play, that regions can play, and really accomplish so much change.
And how do you envision we get this message out, because clearly many of these people are already working in jobs that pay probably less money than they need to live. Are employers engaged? Should we have public-private partnerships? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's both of the above. First of all, I think we have to realize that most people don't have the Waze app for their career. So again, one of the tragedies of the rearview mirror quip, that opportunities are closer than they appear, is that people don't know about those opportunities, and we don't have a good structure for letting people know. And so one of the things we've got to do is make sure that that we're focusing on the side of demand. How can employers play an important bridge in this by being able to identify those pools of talent and reaching into them rather than expecting that people are going to step up? So that's step one. Step two is to then say, okay, how can we help people make that transition? If there are people who are working within your company, then great, that's on you. But you need to still be able to go to those kinds of talent pools and say, hey, here's this opportunity to make more. Here's this opportunity to be more valuable to yourself and the company. And here's what we're going to help you learn to make that jump. If we're talking about talent that's outside of the firm, companies need to realize that this is a way of solving for the skill gaps that they have. And therefore, to your point, Jane, partner with local officials, partner with community college systems. Realize that the local community college system, the local workforce system, is a supply chain, and you need to manage it like any other vendor. You give more business to where it's performing. You send the right signals so that it can be an effective supplier. You give more business to the good ones. You fire the bad ones. But you need to actually create those kinds of signals, and that's going to allow you to create the escalator that brings talent upward.
So I would be remiss if I didn't, in the middle of this, say we're in a pandemic. We have 30, 40, maybe 50 million people by October 1st, when the DPE layoffs start. We're going to have people that are on the street looking. What would be really interesting is to ask you, what do you think are the skills that people should be concentrating on right now? Remembering, if you would, that some people have less than a high school diploma all the way up to a PhD, with colleges laying off.
So I think it's worth thinking about this in a couple of different dimensions. One, there are sets of jobs. So first, I think we have just to think about what are the jobs that people are being displaced from. And to your point, that displacement's not just concentrated in the kind of jobs that we hear about all the time, the high risk jobs, the service industry jobs, but they're really all over the map. We also need to, and by the way, tying to the conversation we were having a few minutes ago, we've done a bunch of work recently with PolicyLink, looking at the impact of the pandemic on communities of color, on immigrant communities, realizing that unfortunately, those who have been hit the hardest are those who are already furthest behind. And so I think we should acknowledge that. But it's important to understand the starting point. We were talking before about this notion of trying to leverage the idea of skill adjacencies, of retraining people not for some theoretical job, training people from scratch. I mean, you've spent so much of your life, of your career working in the workforce system, know that so many retraining programs fail because they're asking people to make too big a jump. If instead of going job to job, we say, how do we go skill to skill? How do we respect the skills that workers have accrued? And then say, what are the kind of opportunities that they can transition to that make use of, that are perhaps in higher demand, that make use of those, of their existing body of skills? And then what's the last layer of skills that will help them make that transition? And so that's an important idea. That's given us, helped us frame the idea of what we call lifeboat jobs. There's certain sets of jobs that are actually, that may make use of the skills that you've got, you may have to step down into them just to keep working. If you're on the Titanic in the middle of the North Atlantic, you don't get fussy about which lifeboat you get into, but you also know that if you're in the North Atlantic in the middle of the winter, you're not going to make it to Canada in a lifeboat. And so you've got to find where's the rescue ship. And so what we've done is we've mapped certain kinds of jobs, which represent, good transition, good immediate term transitions, and then map from them what are the long-term transitions that you can make. Take, for example, somebody who, there's been a lot of discussion recently about these jobs as contact tracers. Contact tracers is a relatively low-skill job. It's probably not the kind of job anyone wants to be in long-term. By the way, we all hope it's temporal and that we won't need contact tracers in a year from now. But the question is, for somebody who's been working in, let's say, working as a server in a restaurant, can they step into that job? Sure. Where do you go from there? Well, it turns out that you're starting to build a set of skills that, if you build onto them further, would allow you to take a range of customer service jobs, to take a bunch of social service jobs, doing entry interviews and clinical interviews and the like, that allow you to move into various sales roles that have significantly more mobility. And so the key thing right now is to think about, where are you right now? What are the jobs that are available? Jobs like shipping clerks and personal care nurses, and IT help desk jobs. And then what's the ladder up? And then at each of those, what's the skills that let you get into the boat? What are the skills that let you move onward from the boat?
Well, you know how much I love the term. I've stolen it already a million times on Lifeboat Jobs. But I want to say what I like most about it is it really respects, the skills that you've earned before. Because if you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, the idea of making that big switch is so disrespectful to what you've done in the past. But it makes you think about this articulation of your skills and the skills you're going to get in that lifeboat job. Talk to me a minute about, if you're someone, regardless of your educational level, how do you really think about the skills that you had? We're so used to just talking about a job title. I was a teacher. What does that mean, right? I was a teacher who became the Assistant Secretary of Labor. That doesn't make sense, right? That's not a logical transition. So how do you think about talking to people about the skills you have, regardless of your past job titles?
So one of the things I would recommend to people is that they start backwards, if you will. We're used to starting out saying, okay, what have I been? Where have I been? What skills did that help me accrue? And of course, when you were given a free writing assignment in grade school, that was always the most painful thing. Most of us don't know how to fill out that page. And especially when we're trying to talk about ourselves. If, on the other hand, you work in reverse and you say, not where have I been, but where am I trying to go? Then what you can start to do is say, what's the vocabulary that's used by employers for those kinds of jobs? People who are hiring for the kind of job that I think I might want to step into, what skills do they ask about? What activities should somebody have done? By the way, you probably have done some of those. I remember when we first started working together, Jane, back when you were in New Jersey, before you were in the US Department of Labor. One of the things which we discovered was that a lot of people who have taken time out to be caregivers, who have had to take care of a sick relative, to take care of kids, when they're returning to the workforce, really struggle to make that articulation. And they struggle because, and for natural reasons, because employers don't understand how that experience is relevant. And of course, the skills that you're talking about, the activities you're talking about, may not seem like business activities. On the other hand, once you take that approach of saying, not where have I been, but where am I going, it becomes a lot easier to say, hey, I was, let's take the example of somebody who's been a caregiver and is shooting for a job as in administrative support. Well, I've been making medical appointments. I've been, doing all sorts of clerical work. Been doing accounting and the like, taking care of somebody's household. Being able to drive that as a means of articulation is really important. In general, I think this is something which is a shift that I know you've led, Jane, in your work, which is how do we solve social problems working from the point of demand? We're used to thinking about social change as being something that you sort of start on the supply side. Well, there's people who need help. How do we help them? And that's exactly the right instinct. But unfortunately, social interventions are really hard to scale. When you start in reverse and you say, what's the talent that an economy needs? What's the talent that employers are struggling to fill? And then you work backwards and say, how do we help them fill it? How can I, as a job seeker, help them fill that? That's where you can actually have great success. And you can have success not just one or two people at a time, but across what I hope is, will be the success of the 40 million people who've been displaced thus far by this pandemic.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you and anybody who knows me knows I'm a people person, but clearly when I talk about trying to solve this problem, it has to begin with business, right? I mean, WorkingNation, people sometimes say, well, WorkingNation is people-centered and business-centered. Right, that's exactly right. But if you don't begin with the needs of business, then you really can't solve the problem of getting people back to work. So I want to ask you a little bit about what you're seeing as big business demands, as all we hear in the news are about layoffs and people shedding jobs. What are you seeing, even through COVID, are big jobs in demand, big skills in demand?
So I think I'd approach that in a couple of ways, right? So there's the sets of jobs and skills that are in demand today. Those are the ones we know about. There's Amazon's desperate to fill its warehouses. We've all changed the way we shop. We have a healthcare system that's in need of overhaul, and a lot of healthcare workers who are needed. There's been strong and continued demand there. But the real question is, what are the jobs going to be of tomorrow? One of the reasons why your point is so spot on, Jane, about starting from the needs of business is that the irony of this economy is, you'd think with 40 million people displaced, sitting on the sidelines, that all the conversation, if we were having this conversation a year ago, we'd be talking about the skill gap. It'd be easy to say, well, that conversation is over. The market's fundamentally reshaped from having excess demand to having excess supply. You know what? We should still be talking about the skill gap. And here's why. Because despite the fact that so many people are displaced, when companies lay people off, when they start hiring again, they don't just hire for the same people they let go. They actually step back and they say, okay, what are the skills we're going to need for the future? Who are the people who have those digital skills, those data skills that will enable them, those business process skills that will enable them to be well positioned for the kind of work that we see driving the next decade. And you know what? In a lot of cases, everyone's now going to start looking for the kind of talent that was already scarce, right? It was already the jobs that you couldn't get, the skills you couldn't get were those data skills. They were those business process skills. They were those digital skills that were driving digital transformations, that were affecting the way businesses are structured around in an age of data, big data. Well, guess what? Everyone's now, as they start to hire back, they're going to want them. And it turns out that what they really want is not those people as specialists. You'd think, okay, well, the world needs to be, we're going to need a bunch of big data scientists, but there's no jobs for anyone else. Actually, that's not how the job market works. What we've been seeing over the last few years, well before this pandemic, but accelerating in this pandemic, is the hybridization of jobs. Essentially, jobs are, Monday morning, jobs are having sex. How do you're starting to see jobs acquiring skills from different domains that never would have shown up in those jobs before. Marketing people increasingly, who are always those right brain people, all of a sudden need left brain data skills because you need to be able to manipulate customer data. But this is true even in middle skill jobs. I was looking the other day at jobs for production technicians. These are factory floor jobs, and looking at how the skills that employers are looking for today for production techs have changed just over the course of the last 6 months from the pandemic. You look at what skills they were looking for beforehand, what are they looking for today? There's been a 60% increase in demand within those jobs on a relative basis, in demand for various kind of business process skills like Kaizen, which is an overall kind of manufacturing process. For math skills, about a 55% increase in demand. Also for various organizational skills and communication skills. At the same time that you've seen a fall off in some of the kind of basic soldering skills and the like. In other words, even in a job like a production tech, the future of work that we've all been talking about and been sweating about is already showing up. It's all that wolf's already at the door. And so the question is, as those jobs start coming back, will the workforce that we have, the people who have 20, 30 years of experience in those jobs, are they ready to step back into them? And so what we have to do right now is think about what are those relaunch skills that help people get back into their jobs? And what are the next step skills that help people move up from the jobs they were displaced into other jobs? And we've analyzed the landscape of jobs, did a bunch of work about 2 years ago for the Business Higher Ed Forum, looking at what are the sets of skills that you need for the new economy, for work in the new economy. And it turns out it's a mix of those kinds of data skills and digital skills with business skills, because it turns out even in technical fields, increasingly people need business process knowledge, the ability to understand and communicate data, and to do basic project management, but it's also human skills. This is the irony, right? The irony of when you look at those jobs that are most hybridized, that are mixing skills the fastest. And definitionally, that means these are the jobs that are most data-driven, that are most tech-enabled. You know what? Those are also the jobs that are most intensive in their demand for human skills. They're the ones that are that literally have double the demand for creativity skills, double the demand for collaboration skills. They have about 50% greater demand for research skills, for writing skills. The people who are going to be driving data, who are going to be driving technology, who are going to be driving automation, are the people who need even more human judgment. So for people to relaunch, for people to take that next step, they need both sets of skills, and we need to help people acquire those. Hopefully, if those are people who are working for you, then the question is, how do you make sure that the workforce you have today is going to be the workforce that you're going to need tomorrow? And so how do you start to build those skills? How do you develop a learning and development organization, set of investments that move people up to acquire that value, to be valuable to you, not just for today, but into the future?
Well, I love that concept of really investing in incumbent workers, because I think sometimes in the last decade, some employers lost that, especially for workers that weren't at the highest level. There was lots of leadership training at the Harvard Business School, but not so much for those people that were in the middle of the workforce because they thought they could go out and buy it instead of make it. So I hope employers really do that. But I have to applaud you. I love the term next step skills. I think that's going to be your new Lifeboat Jobs phrase that I'll steal, because it implies that what you're doing is getting you ready for your next step, not for the rest of your life. That it really implies that you have to keep learning and growing in order to keep pace with the changes in the economy. So I'm going to ask you, how do we make sure that our under-resourced and hard hit with the budgets community college system, our nonprofits who are struggling right now, because everything is depleted. Most philanthropic money has gone for the important things with COVID and maybe moved away from things like job training. But how do we get them to stay focused on this idea of skills and not necessarily everybody going full time, for 2 or 4 years to get a degree immediately, because most workers can't afford to do that?
So I think a couple of things, and I'm so glad you brought us there, because we do have, we talk a lot about the need for people to acquire skills, be they incumbent workers or people on the sidelines. And then we say, well, we throw our hands up in the air, well, where's the infrastructure that can help us with that? Well, we've got a natural infrastructure. We've got a fabulous infrastructure in our community college system, our workforce system. The question is, to your point, how do we make them align? And I would point to a few different things. First, how we can make sure that our community college system is, and other kind of organs of online training, worker training, how do we orient them, to your point, to skills versus degrees? Second, I would ask the question of how do we make sure that we are thinking in terms of the small steps by which people can make quick change and continued change over time. And third, I would think about how we can develop a better listening mechanism to be demand driven in terms of how we orient those programs. So worth just sort of unpacking each of those very briefly. In terms of how we make sure that we have a system that is oriented towards skills, not degrees. Our community college system today is very heavily focused. About 2/3 of conferrals, and perhaps even greater percentage of enrollments, are people coming in the door and saying that we're going to help them get a 2-year degree as a means of moving on to a 4-year degree. And that's a great system where it works. Unfortunately, only 14% of people who start out in a community college, what they call transfer program, ever wind up making it through to a 4-year degree. And so the opportunity to actually re-pivot in the way that some really progressive, really smart community colleges, colleges like LaGuardia Community College in New York, like Dallas College, like Miami-Dade have done, is really about saying, okay, what are those specific transitions? What is the skills that are needed in the workforce? What are the jobs that are needed in the workforce? How do we take the most efficient path for people to get there, be it through a degree program or otherwise? That's number one. Number two, I'd say in terms of this question of how do we make small steps, that's a really important idea. Most of us aren't well equipped to leap tall buildings in a single bound. And yet most of the way that our higher education system, that our training system is oriented is towards saying, how do we, ask you to enter into a program and take this big leap of faith, spend a huge amount of time, and over 2 years we'll get you into, we'll get you a degree that may help you get a good job. Well, that doesn't help me in the near term, and it's asking me to take a big leap of faith. There's an expression that people in the world of education know all too well, which is that life gets in the way. The key question is, how do you help people make small steps? We recently were looking at how people left retail. We looked at millions of people who started out in retail and left. We found actually a non-trivial number who wind up in tech jobs. First, we were like, okay, there's either something wrong in the data, or maybe this is people who were kind of working their way through college. It actually looked more typically like this. I'm selling refrigerators at Best Buy. I get a little bit of training, and I'm move over to selling consumer electronics at Best Buy. Get a little more training, and I'm setting up people's consumer electronics at Best Buy. I get a CompTIA certification, a little more training, and I move over to a proper help desk job, which is sort of a golden gateway job into tech. That didn't happen by trying to leap the tall building in a single bound. That was about helping people make a set of steps. And we can reorient our training system to supporting people through those transitions. We can do it. And key to doing that is that third thing of making sure that we're listening really well. What are employers looking for? What are the skills that are in demand in our local economy? What are the skills that represent the delta between a job that's a dead end and a job that is a step up? And how do you help make sure that people get them? And I think a key to that is making sure people have the data to do it. And so proud that BurningGlass is able to focus on that as our mission.
Well, Matt, what I love about you is you're so smart. You know all these things, but you can really break it down into realistic bites so that real people listening understand and walk away with a clear example. So I want to end on saying what's next. What should we be looking for from Burning Glass? What should people can go to your website, burningglass.com, and see your reports. But what's coming? What should we be watching for on the horizon?
One of the things that we're spending a lot of time thinking about right now is what are the jobs that are going to drive the post-COVID economy. Again, we've talked about this before. There's so much focus right now. Okay, well, look, we've got so many people displaced. How do we just help them find jobs today? And we need to do that. We need to help them find the lifeboats. But we also need to map what are the jobs that are going to transform the world in the 2020s. We've been focused on 4 key transformational currents in the job market. One of them is what we call the readiness economy. Another is, not surprisingly, called the remote economy. Third is the logistics economy. And a fourth is the automated economy. And each of those represent a kind of transformation that's not hard to understand coming. And each of those, when you unpack it, suggests that there's going to be a whole new set of jobs and skills that are going to reshape the opportunity landscape for companies, for regions. The companies who plan for that, the regions who plan for those kinds of jobs will have great success. Let me give you an example. Think about that first one. I mentioned the readiness economy. Thomas Friedman from the New York Times has talked about COVID-19 as being not a black swan event, the kind of event that you can't predict coming, but as being a black elephant event. It was the elephant in the room that nobody was paying attention to. Well, guess what? We're all paying attention. So in a post-COVID economy, I think companies and governments are going to spend a lot more time and attention on questions of readiness, not just for the next pandemic, but readiness in terms of infrastructure, readiness in terms and infrastructure vulnerability, in terms of vulnerability to cyber attack, in terms of in terms of environmental catastrophe, and a range of others. When you think of each of those, there are sets of technology, sets of skills that you can invest in that will give you that kind of readiness. And so that's an opportunity for the people who can get ahead of that, both for the workers who can get ahead of that, but also the companies who can acquire that talent. They'll be in the catbird seat. For everyone else who's sort of waiting around till those transformations happen, it goes back to that point that you can have excess supply and excess demand in the same place. Everyone's going to need the people who can drive a readiness economy, who can drive a remote economy, who can drive an automated economy, who can drive the resurgence of advanced manufacture as companies tried to diversify their supply chains. And when they want them, they won't have that talent available. You got to start planning for it today. And so we're looking forward to mapping it out.
Well, listen, I hope really smart government officials, economic developers, policymakers are listening to you, Matt, because you make total sense to me always. But I want to thank you so much for spending time today and meeting the Ideagen population.
Jane, this was so much fun as always. George, thanks so much for having us.
It's great. Thank you.